This is a story of who we were, how we got here.
Houston, the Eagle has landed. Roger, Tranquility.
And where we are going.
You've got mail.
So join us as we take history off the page.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second half of our episode on the triumph of technology, planes, cars, and radio. As a reminder, this is the second half of a larger episode that was recorded all at once, and basically because of time purposes, I had to kind of cut it off in the middle, and so this is the second half. If you missed that first half, we basically discussed the importance of technological change in the 1920s as a whole, and then we focused on the rise of the airplane. We talked about people like Charles Lindbergh, we talked about Amelia Earhart, we talked about some of the figures in Europe themselves that are important in the story of flight, talked about the Zeppelins a little bit. But in this part, we're going to tackle the rise of the automobile and the development of motor culture, and then we'll also discuss at the end the invention of radio as well. So we hope you enjoy it, and remember, this is kind of all part of one episode. This is just the second half, kind of spliced into two. So I hope you enjoy it, and thanks a lot for listening. Okay, enough about airplanes. Air travel, of course, was certainly the most dramatic technological barrier broken at the start of the 20th century, but perhaps the most important, the most consequential for our daily lives today was the mechanization of travel. Of course, what I mean by that is the invention of the automobile. You know, one can really argue that the automobile is the machine that defines the course of 20th century history. Now, what I mean by that is obviously a lot of events happen, a lot of turning points happen in the century, but think about how fundamentally different your world is because of the fact that we have cars. Right, we just spent a lot of time talking about airplanes. How many times have you actually traveled in an airplane? Dozen times, maybe? Maybe some of you have traveled 100 times. Maybe business travelers, you get up into the hundreds of times. How many times have you traveled by car? Forget about just in your entire life. How many times in the last week or month have you used a car to drive somewhere? I drove this morning. I drove to take the kids to school, drove to work, drive back to school to pick them up. I'll drive back to the house. I'll drive later today to do some social activities that I'm going to be involved in. Think about all the other ways that the mechanization of travel has affected your daily life. Think about all the different things in your life that you rely upon that are related to the automobile. Did you go to the grocery store recently? How did all that food make it to the grocery store? Wasn't most of it, if not all of it, brought in by trucks somehow? I mentioned taking my own children to school just a minute ago. How do most kids get to school? There are some places where they walk. There are some places where they can take public transportation. But for the vast majority of students, especially the higher up you get, the idea of commuting is important. You have a school bus, you have parents that are dropping them off. The teachers themselves are usually driving to school, or many of them are driving to school. How about work? Again, if you live in a major city, you can probably take the subway. That's great if you're able to do that. Some of you are able to bike in certain communities. That's fantastic. Sometimes I bike into work if I can. But how many people sit in lines, in cars, every day, moving back and forth in order to be economically productive? I know this is post-pandemic. We have plenty of people that are telecommuting today. Yes, the world is changing. But think about all the people in the world that have to drive to work. Think about all the institutions and networks that you rely on that are dependent on cars and trucks. What if, God forbid, I need to call the police? Do the police say, okay, Dr. Hansen, we'll be there as soon as the 4:15 bus can drop us off? Of course they don't. That would be insane, right? If the police had to just use public transport. And it's not just the police. Think about all the emergency workers, the doctors, the firefighters. Think about maybe not emergency, but think about all the contractors. Think about all the electricians, the plumbers, all the people that you need to come and help you in your house, your apartment, all the structures that are built, your office. How are they going to get there? The vast majority of them get there using the internal combustion engine. So it's not an understatement to say that out of all these revolutionary episodes of modernity that we've been talking about, perhaps the car has had the biggest, most fundamental, most sustained impact on European society and on global society as a whole. But cars are important not only because of their practical effects, but also because of the way that they affect Europeans and more broadly human society in terms of psychology. Cars are a status symbol. They are personal statements about who we are and what we think about ourselves. How many of the men out there, when you think back to high school and you think about what was the car that you either got or that you wanted to get, you wanted something big, you wanted something fast, you wanted something perhaps that was loud. Right? If you're old enough, that was the Corvette. You wanted something that was powerful. I'm recording this in Greenville, South Carolina. I grew up in Charleston, South Carolina. Tell you what, one of the things that is most associated with the South is the idea of the truck. Think about David Allan Coe's famous song about "You Never Call Me by My Name Anymore." He says, I wrote the perfect country and Western song. And his friend says, no, you didn't. You didn't talk about trucks. How can you have a country song that doesn't talk about trucks? Well, why do so many Southern men want to have trucks? Yeah, some of us go hunting. We go camping. There is that occasional need to haul something from time to time. But isn't the real value of a truck its masculinity? Isn't it really about the vehicle's power? How many times do we really need to be able to pull 1,000 pounds with our truck? 2,000 pounds? Probably not that much unless you're engaged in a specific profession. Maybe you're a landscaper. Maybe you have a travel trailer that you're pulling, something like that. But most people don't need that. You certainly don't need to drive your truck off-road up a mountain like they do in all these TV commercials. You're probably not going mudding out of necessity or driving again up a 30-degree hill. When was the last time any of you drove off of a paved road? It's not necessary, but we like the idea of it. We like the idea of having a machine that is so powerful that I can drive it up a hill, that I can tow an airplane if I want to. You don't believe me? Go and look at truck advertising from basically the 1980s until relatively recently. Chevy, of course, they had this little jingle. It was almost like a Bob Seger song. Chevy, like a rock, right? Your truck is like a rock because it's strong and it's hard and it's masculine, it's manly. Since 1979, Ford pickup trucks have had the kind of slogan, built Ford tough. Because a pickup truck is manly, it's masculine, it's tough, it's powerful. You know, even the new electric pickup trucks, when they invented those, they couldn't just say, oh, buy the new Ford 150 because it saves money on gas. That's not a very masculine way to sell your truck. Oh, this one is eco-efficient. You're not going to market trucks that way. You got to sell it as being manly. What is the electric Ford F-150 called? It's called the Lightning. Because the Lightning is powerful. The Lightning is Thor. The Lightning is masculine. What do you do with your electric pickup truck? Do you save money on gas? No, silly. I need this electric pickup truck because when my house loses power, I can plug it in and I can reverse power my house for a couple days. That's pretty cool. That's pretty masculine. I'm saving the day because I'm a man. So trucks are masculine. Cars, in general, are signs of identity. Why do you need a BMW that can drive 200 miles an hour if the speed limit is 70 miles an hour? Because it's a luxurious, powerful, expensive machine. I drive a BMW that tells you something about my social class. That tells you, as my uncle used to say, you got the long cash. There's more, of course. Cars aren't just about status symbols and about practical networks and things like that. Cars are also about freedom. Because really, isn't that what car ownership, at a very practical sense, at a very practical level, isn't that what owning a car does? Cars are freedom. Now, we have, before the invention of the car, and even if you're someone that doesn't have a car, we have mass transit, we have trains, we have ways to get places that don't involve a car. But if you live in a big city and you're used to taking the subway places, isn't it a pain in the butt to always have to fix your schedule to whatever the mass transit schedule is? You live in New York City, you live in other big cities, you go to Paris or Berlin, you want to go out to the bars, great. Doesn't it suck when you have to leave before the subway closes down? But when you have a car, you can travel whenever you want. When you have a car, for the most part, you can go wherever you want. I'm not constrained to existing rail lines or existing rail networks. If I do want to drive up a mountain, even if there's no road, if I have a powerful enough car, I can do that. Another way that we can conceive of the idea of freedom is to control the space around us. If I'm riding on the New York City subway, as I mentioned, and I'm a woman, and it's rush hour, there is a decent chance I'm going to get groped. There is a decent chance that my fellow travelers might be annoying. We've all sat next to someone on an airplane, and it's like, I just want to close my eyes, I want to watch my movie, and this person keeps on talking to me. Or this person keeps talking to themselves. They're talking on their cell phone. They're talking to their neighbor. They're being loud. Maybe they have gas. I'll give you two examples from my life of travel and crazy encounters. When I was in college, I decided to go up to Sweden and then to Norway to visit my sort of ancestral roots. And I sat next to this Norwegian guy, and he started telling me this story about how he and Clint Eastwood were working together to try to prove that the CIA was trying to kill then President Bill Clinton. And so this guy said, oh, I've got this picture of Clint Eastwood and it's signed, and that's how he told me that Clint Eastwood was in on this and that he was on my side. And I'm going, what? And then he starts talking about, well, then that one night I woke up and I forgot to take my meds and I was in the bathtub and I had a giant gash on my leg and I was bleeding out. And here, do you want to see my scar? And he pulled his pants down in the middle of the car. And I'm like, what on earth is going on? Another fun experience happened in 1998. I was on a train to Florence in Rome. And this was right around the time, or right after the time the Titanic had come out, and Celine Dion and My Heart Will Go On. And there's like 20 Italian teenage girls on this train with me for 2 hours. And they have a boombox because we didn't have MP3 players at the time. And they just keep listening to My Heart Will Go On over and over and over again. And I'm like, please, someone shoot me. This is torture. Because I could not control the environment in which I was traveling. But with a car, I can do whatever I want. I feel like rolling down the windows and feeling the wind, and it's a beautiful sunny day. I'm going to stick my hand out, roll down the highway. That's what I do. If I feel like, wow, man, I've had a tough day, I just want to think about something else, I'm going to put on a podcast, history podcast. Maybe I've just had an amazing experience. I want to rock out. I'm going to blast some music. I can do any of that stuff because I control the environment in which I'm traveling. I'm cold. I'm going to turn the heat up. I'm hot. I'm going to turn the air conditioner on. Cars, more than anything else, are about freedom. They are about mobility and about control over that mobility. Now, the story of the car starts with the need to mechanize travel, to come up with something better, as we talked about way back when at the beginning of our first podcast about the idea that we need to be able to travel independently of animal power or human power. Animal power and human power are fickle. They wear out, they get tired, they break down. So how do we move past dependence on natural or animate sources of energy? Europeans first began experimenting with these ideas in the 18th century. And by the 1790s, they'd even begun to create a number of mechanical devices known as engines that used chemical reactions to generate force and thus motion. Now, of course, the best example of this, which we talked about during our lecture on industrialization, was the steam engine. Right? How can we get the water out of these deep shafts that we've dug? We're going to use steam power. We're going to burn some coal, going to burn some wood. And eventually that leads in the early 1800s to the idea of putting a carriage on rails in order to create the railroad. Now, as they are in the process of inventing the railroad, they are also experimenting with engines that can drive this. We have people between 1790 and 1810, such as Thomas Mead, John Stevens, the Niepce brothers, the Swiss François Isaac de Rivaz. And they're all kind of playing around with this notion of an engine. Some of them are fueled by petroleum, some by natural gas, hydrogen, oxygen, combinations thereof. In 1853, the Italian father and son team of Eugenio and Felice Matucci actually built the first real modern combustion engine, and they actually get a patent for it. So by the time of the 1850s, right, we've got the massive boilers that are powering trains. We have the first real modern combustion engine. But the problem is that they are too weak to overcome the barriers created by friction. Right? Basically, travel, to move things about, there's too much weight, there's too much friction, there's too many uneven surfaces. So the really important breakthrough in the history of cars comes in the 1880s, led by a German engineer named Carl Benz. Now, Benz was a brilliant student, but he's one of these guys that kind of struggles in the business world. And so in the late 1870s, he basically starts trying to tinker, becomes kind of the classical inventor, trying to figure out, how do I make more money? Well, one of his first inventions was a petrol-fueled engine, which he patents in 1880. He then developed a number of other engine parts that, it's not just about the idea of how do we have the explosion, how do we have the kind of fuel system, but there's other parts to the motor that make it work. And we're talking about a car motor. We need something to generate the explosion in the beginning. That becomes the spark plug, which is also invented by Benz. We're talking about something like the carburetor, the clutch, the gear shift, and the initial radiator. So Benz puts all of these things together in 1885 and creates what historians largely recognize as the first official motor vehicle. Now, if you look at pictures of this, most of us would not recognize it as a car. It is basically a horse-drawn carriage where you put like an engine in the back under the part that the person sits at. And you've got these two giant sort of bicycle wheels, right? Imagine the old bicycle wheels, right? The big, 6 or 7 foot tall bicycle wheels. There's two of those on the sides, and then you have like a little bicycle wheel in the front, and that's kind of how you steer it. As you can imagine, this is very cumbersome. It's not very effective. It's slow. It's difficult to drive. And when I say slow, I mean going 1 or 2 miles per hour. The idea of walking is superior to the first car. Another issue is it can't go up hills. So imagine you're driving your car and you get to a hill, you're going to get out and push your car up the hill and then get back in it. That is the early automobiles of the 1880s. Of course, the idea isn't that this is the perfect automobile, it's that this is the first time we're mechanizing transport. Just like those early airplanes invented by the Wright brothers. It's not necessarily impressive what they're able to do in the beginning in terms of how far they go, how fast they go, but it's the technological breakthrough that you can do this, and now all we need to do is make it more powerful. Benz shows off his new invention at the 1889 World's Fair in Paris. And by 1894, he could boast of over 100 sales. Now, incidentally, one of the key issues with the early automobile, of course, is, okay, I have an automobile, I can drive it around, but what happens when I run out of gas? What happens when I run out of fuel? This is the 1880s. There aren't gas stations on every corner. There isn't a network to bring fuel to all these different sites because we don't have cars yet. So how am I going to get the gas to power my car? The answer is the pharmacy, right? We already have a network of pharmacies all over. They're already used to selling kind of weird things that you only need once in a while, chemical-ish type things. And so the pharmacy becomes the initial way that people get gas. Now, there's an interesting kind of inside joke here that I'm going to reveal. If you ever watched Back to the Future, and you're Back to the Future fans, you'll know that there's a scene when one of the main characters, Doc Brown, he makes this kind of joke about, well, I'm sure in the future plutonium is available in every corner drugstore, but in 1955, it's kind of hard to get. And of course, when we saw the movie, it's like, oh, that's, funny, haha. Of course, we don't have plutonium in corner drugstores in 1985. But it's an inside joke based on what was going on in the 1880s, when the fuel for cars was literally at the corner drugstore. So there you go. If you learn nothing else during today's episode, you will learn this deep, deep inside joke that only scientists and only kind of techies got from Back to the Future. At any rate, just as we saw with airplanes, Benz is not the only one tinkering with engines at the time. In the 1870s, a fellow German inventor, Gottlieb Daimler, had also been working on gas-powered engines. And about 10 years later, in the mid-1880s, around the same time that Benz comes up with his first car, Daimler and his collaborator Wilhelm Maybach also complete a functional gas-powered motor. They also begin sticking it on a chassis, trying to mechanize travel, trying to create essentially the first car. Now again, Benz is kind of given historical credit for this, but Daimler and Maybach achieved something very similar around the same time period. In 1890, they decide to found the Daimler Motorengesellschaft, or DMG, which is one of the world's first car companies. And by the early 1890s, they had established contracts with firms in places like Britain and France in order to manufacture engines. They kind of seed the car industry beyond its initial German home. Again, these are not major corporations yet. These are just basically small inventors. They don't have the resources to be able to fund massive investment in cars yet. So they're going to contract out, they're going to contact like-minded thinkers in other countries, and those like-minded thinkers will then begin to develop their own native auto industries. Now, we've started the story of car manufacturing with Germany, and to a lot of us today, that makes sense because, when we think about fine automobiles, we think about Mercedes-Benz, we think about BMW, we think about Porsche, we think about Germany as being the country of the car. But before World War II, it is actually France that is the heart of car manufacturing. Both Benz and Daimler and Maybach were all eventually dismissed by their boards of directors in the late 1890s because the directors want a more cautious approach to the automobile. Daimler is, in fact, bought out in 1892. He basically has a heart attack, and they say, oh, this is a great opportunity to sideline him. Benz actually, I said the 1890s, Benz actually makes it to 1903 before he's forced to retire. It's going to sound kind of weird to say this, but in the early history of car manufacturing, the kind of big names that we associate with a lot of the major companies today, they are actually fired, replaced, forced to retire very quickly on in the process. This is not the Silicon Valley of the 2010s where, these kind of Mark Zuckerbergs and Peter Thiels and Jack Dorsey and all the kind of tech inventors that everybody lauds today. They have all this power. This is not the case in the 1890s. These corporate boards, once they're established, once they can get rid of the founders, they do it actually as quickly as possible. I'm going to talk more later in the podcast about Henry Ford, but did you know that Henry Ford's first car company goes out of business in less than a year? Or it's about 14 months, so it's about a year. Henry Ford then founds a second car company where he is, again, fired by the board of directors who get rid of him and they say, you know what, we're not going to call this company after Ford. He's a bum. Let's call it after something native to Detroit. How about the guy who discovered and sort of founded Detroit, Cadillac? And so the origins of the Cadillac Motor Company lie with Henry Ford. Now, on his third try, Henry Ford gets it right. He creates the Ford Motor Company. It becomes successful. We'll talk about them more in just a second. By the way, we started off with the story of Benz and, of course, Maybach and Daimler. What about the other big stories behind the German brands? What about Mercedes and BMW? There's kind of interesting stories behind both of these. Mercedes actually was a division of DMG that was started in 1901 when you have this enterprising Austrian car salesman who is living in Nice, and his name is Emil Jelinek, and he's trying to sell German cars in France at a time when the French don't particularly like the Germans. But of course, we just had the Franco-Prussian War within living memory. France lost that war. They want to get Alsace-Lorraine back. They want a kind of revenge war. Not a good time to be selling German products in France. And so what he does is he says, hey, let's come up with a new name for a new brand. Let's call it Mercedes, which just happens to be his daughter's nickname. And so using this new name, the company becomes, or the line becomes very successful. Jelinek was fascinated by auto racing. There's a whole history of the beginnings of interest in cars and why do people like it. A huge part of it is about masculinity. A huge part of it is about status. What do we like? Well, we like cars that go fast. And so auto racing becomes a huge way for people, elites in the early 1900s, to support car racing, to get interested or hooked by the idea of the car. It's not the practical side of things that appeals to us. It's the power. It's a kind of mechanized steed that I can ride, that I can race. At any rate, Jelinek kind of pushes this brand in France. Eventually, they turn it into its own line, which becomes Mercedes, which later on down the line will merge with Benz. Now, BMW, on the other hand, is actually a relative latecomer to the car game. Don't know if you guys knew this, but BMW is not founded as a car company. They are founded in making engines for airplanes. It actually starts during World War I. The idea is just, we're going to build airplanes, or at least the engines for airplanes. That happens until 1923 when they say, okay, we've perfected these engines. We're good at making engines. What can we make that's going to go fast besides airplanes? The answer is the motorcycle. Think about a motorcycle. We're not going to go into the deep history of the motorcycle, but put a powerful engine on a lightweight motorcycle. You can go fast, and that's pretty cool. And so BMW only really gets into the car business in 1928. Finally, of course, we're talking about speed and power in German cars. How do we not bring up Porsche? There is a lot that we could say about Ferdinand Porsche, the founder and inventor of the Porsche, basically, brand. We may do a separate podcast on him at some point because the story of Ferdinand Porsche is also the story of the Nazi Party. He is not just someone that benefits from Nazism and is kind of a sort of liminal figure in the movement, but his story is heavily intertwined with that of National Socialism. He is a prominent National Socialist, more or less. Okay, so let's set aside German cars for the moment. Let's talk about France, because as I said, France is the heart of the automobile industry before World War I. Now, the French car industry is basically launched by a man named Armand Peugeot, who spent the 1890s playing with Benz engines and motorbikes, right? So he's contracting out, he's buying a bunch of them, he's sticking them on various things. right? The car is not just the engine, but it is the total experience of the car. And so in 1896, Peugeot will set up his first dedicated car factory. He actually becomes the largest French producer of cars by the time of his death in 1913. But the real star of the French car market is probably a name that you're not familiar with. And that is a man named Émile Levasseur, who introduced many of the aspects of the modern car that are still in use today. This would include moving the engine from the rear of the car to the front where most of the engines are today. Why do we do that? Because if we put the engine in the front, then we have more room for passengers behind it. Another thing he does is he invents the water-cooled radiator, and he puts that radiator in the front of the car. Think about how many movies you've seen where the radiator breaks down, or how many times your own radiator is broken down. Where is it? It's in the front of the car where it's nice and easy to get to. He also introduces the crankshaft, although luckily we don't have to use that as much today, along with things like the clutch and the gear stick. And he kind of puts all of these things together and invents the first modern transmission. All these changes, in turn, as I mentioned, open up more room for passengers, and he helps transform the idea of the car from a horseless carriage into something that is new. If you think about the layout, the chassis, the basic idea of the modern car, it's not quite the same as a carriage. It's not quite the same as saying, okay, we're just going to get rid of the horses and we'll put a motor in, and that'll drive this horseless carriage. Levasseur also organized the world's first car race from Paris to Rouen in 1894. And again, as I mentioned, this idea of racing becomes a key way to market cars or to make them seem appealing. The elite, the nobility, the super wealthy in 1900, 1910, they really get into cars, but not because they need a better mode of transportation. It is a way to compete with each other. What can be more masculine, more aristocratic, more heroic, more chivalrous, dare I say, at the turn of the century than competing against your fellow aristocrats? Why are the aristocrats always going out hunting? It's not because they need the food. It's because they're competing with each other to show who is more capable, who is more skilled, who is more manly. Now, unfortunately, as we know in the modern era, car racing is not something that is without risk. Many of you that grew up in the 1980s and 1990s, you know the story of Dale Earnhardt, the Intimidator, one of the kind of legendary race car drivers of all time. And of course, he's killed in a car accident. Well, this is also what happened to Monsieur Levasseur. He is killed in 1896 in a car crash. Now, so far I've introduced you to some of the major names in the European market. We don't have time to get into all of them, but one that we should mention who is from the American context, who nevertheless proves to be incredibly important in the history of car manufacturing, is Henry Ford. So I do want to just briefly mention a little bit about the story of Henry Ford. As I mentioned, he starts off and is a failure. His first two businesses collapse. He's basically fired from the second one. But the third one manages to succeed. And part of the reason that Ford's company, the Ford Motor Company, that it is successful is that unlike many of its kind of competitors, it moves away from the idea of power and speed and luxury, and it decides instead to focus on practicality. In 1908, Ford will introduce the very famous Model T. The Model T is basically a very practical car. It is, as we might say, a no-frills car. It has no speedometer. It has no windshield wipers. Some of them don't even have doors on them. The idea here is not that you're going to drive a car with no doors, but that you can purchase those later on down the road. You can buy a kit. You can kind of come up with something on your own. But basically, the Model T is super popular because it is about efficiency. It is about practicality. And it becomes the first best-selling car. In the course of its first 2 years, before cars are popular, they sell over 10,000 of them in less than 2 years. By the time they stopped making the Model T in 1927, they had sold over 15 million of them in the United States, in Europe, worldwide. Of course, another reason that we know Henry Ford is that he is the inventor, not of the factory, not of the kind of basic idea of construction or even mechanization, but he is the guy who comes up with the idea of the assembly line, or at least he is the guy who perfects the idea of the assembly line. If instead of having workers working individually on a car, doing all the various jobs related to it, if I specialize them, if I rationalize production, and I just give this worker one set of tasks to do, and I move the car on an automated belt down the line so that workers don't have to go anywhere, they're not moving around themselves, well, I can increase the productivity of my workers dramatically. In the case of something like the Model T, it used to take about 12.5 man-hours to put together a Model T. With the assembly line, that is reduced to just 1.5 hours. And so again, a key part of the story of cars is not just manufacturing them in terms of the technical specifications, but on the production side of things, producing them in a way that is economically efficient. That becomes a huge, huge part of what it means to build a car. Now, again, there's a lot more that we could say about Henry Ford. Very kind of interesting character, very kind of Germanophile guy, becomes a peace activist during World War I, wants to kind of not have the United States be involved in it, initially kind of slow walks production of vehicles for the U.S. military. Henry Ford is not known as a very nice guy for most of his workers. Of course, today, one of the best things that he's known for is that he openly promotes anti-Semitism. He actually buys a local Detroit paper and turns it into an anti-Semitic paper. He publishes this kind of fake document called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is this conspiracy. There's these Jewish bankers. They supposedly control the world. And Henry Ford is popularizing that. He wants people to know about it. Henry Ford even becomes very popular in Nazi Germany, so much so that right before his death, he actually wins an award from the Nazis. So there is a lot more that we can say about Henry Ford, but unfortunately, we don't have time to get into it today. To be honest, there's a lot more we could say about a number of these companies. Austin, which eventually becomes MG. We talk about Chevrolet, General Motors. But all the patterns behind most of these companies are very similar. Basically, in the first 2 decades of major car production, the 1890s up to World War I, you have all of these little inventors. They all start founding car companies. They all start kind of struggling, trying to produce something that will sell. But it's only with World War I that car making becomes truly profitable. And this is, of course, because as the war breaks out, as the war develops, the armies realize mechanizing transport is pretty important. Part of the success of the German armies in the 1870s is the use of the railroad. Part of the reason one could argue that they failed to take France in 1914 in the very beginning of the war is that they are largely not mechanized yet. There's still a lot of horse and buggies, horses pulling around artillery, food, ammunition, and your armies can basically outrun them, so there's a limit to how fast they can go. One of the great car companies of Italy, the Fabbrica Italiana di Automobili Torino, or Fiat, as you all know them today, basically gets its start before the war, founded by Giovanni Agnelli. But the reason that they become successful is they get these large contracts for motor vehicles and airplane engines from the Italian government during the war. To give you an idea of how important this is, by 1918, Fiat is the 3rd largest company in all of Italy. And we haven't talked much about post-World War I Italy, but one of the things that happens, of course, is you have the rise of Benito Mussolini. Guess who is going to be buddy-buddy with Mussolini and the fascists? Giovanni Agnelli. And so Fiat's future is kind of secured by these close contacts, first with the liberal democratic government, and then later on, after World War I, with Mussolini's government. Now, there are other car companies we could mention. One that I just want to highlight that also kind of becomes a thing because of World War I is the Škoda brand, which is manufactured in Czechoslovakia. Škoda was initially an arms factory. And when World War I ends, they go, okay, well, we don't have this tremendous demand for weapons, for ammunition and such after World War I. What are we going to do with our large manufacturing plant? Maybe we should make automobiles. And so this happens in 1919. Two other companies that we can briefly mention, the French car makers Renault and Citroën. These are both significantly boosted by World War I. They're both founded beforehand. But again, they need trucks, they need cars for the army. And so these become very popular. Renault, incidentally, has one of history's great marketing triumphs in 1914. As the German army is approaching Paris, this is part of the Schlieffenplan, talked about it in the World War I episode. The only way to stop them is to bring this army out from the city of Paris. How are we going to do that? We got to get them into this gap as quickly as possible. We're going to use taxis. Who's driving the taxis, or what kind of taxis are they? They are, for the most part, Renault vehicles. And so after World War I is over, Renault can say, look, my car helped save France at the Miracle on the Marne. Now, car usage in the 1920s begins to expand, not only because of the demand created during the war, but also because the companies themselves increasingly associate the car with modernity. We talked a little bit about this with the production of cars being modernized, bringing down price levels. Now some middle-class people in the 1920s can begin to afford them. Car companies also fully embrace modern advertising techniques. We talked about this a little bit in our last podcast episode on the metropolis and the way that advertising is not just kind of a normal default, there's ads there, but advertising is in your face, capture your attention, manipulate you. Well, Citroën begins this process in the 1920s, led by André Citroën, who is the founder of the company. One of the things that he does is he's going to take his brand to auto shows, car races. When we market the car, we don't just take a picture of the car and, well, here's a car in a barn. We're going to go out into the great outdoors. One of the amazing things that Citroën does is he actually pays the French government to put his name on the Eiffel Tower. So between 1925 and 1934, they literally have Citroën's name in lights on the side of the Eiffel Tower. Another important name that we have to mention in the history of cars was GM's chairman, not the first chairman, but one of the early chairmen. His name was Alfred P. Sloan. Sloan introduces many of the concepts that are fundamental, not necessarily to the car itself, but to the automotive industry. Have you ever traded in a car? Have you ever bought a car on credit? These are all innovations that were developed or came up with by Alfred P. Sloan. Another thing he does is he invents the notion of what's called Sloanism. Sloanism is the idea that once middle-class people begin being able to afford cars, well, how do I, as wealthy or aristocratic, as kind of elite snobbish guy, how do I show or distinguish myself from those other people? When I go to, drive down the street, I want people to see me and go, well, there's somebody that's got a lot of money. So one of the things that Sloan comes up with is the idea of distinguishing within models of cars, right? Do you drive the normal car? Do you drive the sport? Do you drive the elite? There are all these different kind of upgrades that we can do, add runners to the side, add fancier headlights. Doesn't make the car any better necessarily, but it looks better, right? It's a status symbol. So we owe that to Alfred P. Sloan. Another thing he does too, which is kind of related in the same vein, he says every year the model should be different. Every year the model should be more modern, more bells, more whistles. We're going to create demand by outdating what we already bought or what we already sold. So, of course, this becomes a key part of car manufacturing today, right? Those of you that lease cars, why do you lease the car? Well, because the newer models tend to be nicer, tend to be newer. There's new bells and whistles. Again, you have Alfred P. Sloan to thank for that. Now, so far we've been talking about the benefits of cars and automotive travel and why they're amazing, why people associate them with modernity. We should note that there is a little bit of anxiety that they provoke as well. It sounds kind of weird to say this, but if you think about it, people are not used to the idea that objects are going to move around at 20 or 30 miles an hour. It's hard enough in the modern world getting my kids to look both ways before they cross the street. Imagine living in a society before people were really familiar with the concept of the car. The idea that there is a road and that things might travel quickly on that road. Yes, maybe there'll be horses and buggies that come along, plenty of accidents that happen in big cities before this, but we don't have a culture of car driving. We don't have in the early 1900s traffic signs or traffic lights or a sense that, okay, there's a stop sign here. One of the things that you see even into the 1920s is there is this huge problem of hit and run. I live in a rural community. Here comes some rich snob guy, jerkily driving quickly by, going 30, 40 miles an hour. Boom, he hits my kid. Boom, he hits my cow. Does he stop to help? No, he just drives along. And so what happens? This isn't just a one-off. Things are so bad that in the 1920s, there are plenty of examples of rural communities where they tear their roads up. They say, we don't want cars in this town. To help combat this problem, in August 1914, the city of Cleveland installs the first proper traffic light. In Detroit, fittingly enough, in 1920, they realize, you know what, it might be beneficial to have more than just stop and go. Maybe you need this kind of yellow caution so that, if it's going to turn red, people learn to slow down or speed up and get through it as many people do today. The first European traffic lights start going up in the early 1920s, 1923. And around the same time in the UK, they come up with this idea that, well, maybe if we give pedestrians designated crossing areas, maybe drivers can look for them and maybe we won't have so many accidents. Of course, if you go to the UK today, if you are a pedestrian and you are struck by a car and you are not in a pedestrian zone, guess what? It's your fault and you have to pay for the damages. Here in the United States, of course, I can't just hit any particular pedestrian, even if they are doing the wrong thing. I'm supposed to be a careful driver, which I am, of course, and you don't want to hit anything. You're responsible for anything you hit, even if they're in the wrong spot. So I am responsible. Doesn't mean that sometimes people do dumb things. And the person looking the other way or looking down at their cell phone, crossing the road, not in a crossing walk. Yes, there are times that I want to maybe not run them over, but just kind of bump them, wake them up and say, hey, idiot, pay attention. I'm sounding like such a dad right now. I apologize for that. But basically, over the course of the 1920s, we start to see the emergence of modern car culture that we have today. Another thing, of course, that I've mentioned that we need to have modern car cultures is gas stations. These begin to be built in the 19-teens in the United States and in the early 1920s in Europe. By the time you get to 1929, there are over 55,000 filling stations in the United Kingdom. By the time we get to the 1930s, car ownership has passed from being kind of plaything for wealthy people to being something that is affordable for most of the middle class. This is more the case in the United States, maybe a little bit in the UK, but especially the United States is the country par excellence of the automobile. In Europe, it's going to take a little bit longer. In Germany, we don't really have widespread car ownership until actually after World War II, although the Nazis will try to do something about this, and we'll talk about Volkswagen and why that is so important to the Nazi dictatorship. But we have, again, this kind of more democratic or more democratized car ownership that's going on by the time you get to the 1930s. And there are a couple of really fascinating signs of this, which is basically many of the companies aligned with car companies that are involved in production of things that you need in order to operate a motor vehicle. Tire producers like Michelin, gas companies or oil companies, they begin to market the idea of leisure travel and automobiles as a way of spurring more growth, spurring more demand for their products. So one of the first companies to do this was Michelin, whose founders, Edouard and André, basically began giving away a guidebook for motorists in 1900. And alongside the kind of idea of, well, here are some things that you can visit, here are some routes you can take, right? This is the infancy of automobile travel. One of the barriers to travel is, well, these cars break down a lot. What happens if I break down in some town that I don't know? I don't have Chat GPT. I don't have Siri. I don't have smartphones and the internet. So how am I going to find a repair shop? Well, the Michelin brothers say, look, we're going to give you that information. You can carry this with you. And that way, if you get into a pickle, you can get yourself out of it. Don't be afraid to travel because you don't have the information or the knowledge of what's around you. In 1922, the Michelin brothers began charging for this guidebook. They also began adding new categories such as restaurants and hotels. And they start assigning the businesses in these guides a rating. Of course, this idea of ratings for travel guides, whether you're talking about a published thing like Let's Go, Rick Steves, Fedor's, something like that, like a book, whether you're talking about Zagat, whether you're talking about TripAdvisor, whether you're talking about Viator, whatever, all of this goes back to these early companies associated with motor travel who were trying to push travel, trying to facilitate travel to drive up demand. Now, Michelin is not the only company promoting this early automotive industry. As I mentioned, oil companies are also fascinated by it, trying to kind of encourage it. In the UK, as early as 1925, the Shell Oil Company launched an ad campaign titled See Britain First. And they followed in 1934 with the first issue of their travel guide. Finally, as demand for driving began to build, several governments began to launch massive efforts to build new modern road networks that would be cars only. Think about the idea of motor travel, and then think about the idea that you're sharing this with people on horseback, with cart and buggies. Right? This is going to make car travel very problematic, very slow. But in the 1920s, they start thinking about the idea of building transportation networks that are cars only. The United States, as usual, is a pioneer here in motor travel. In the U.S., they start working on the National Trail System. Later on, this will become the basis of Route 66, which so many of you know and love today. We also have the Lincoln Highway that started in 1913. In Europe, the country that is the foremost leaders in the development of a motorway system is actually Italy. They begin to create one of the world's first interstate systems under the leadership of Count Piero Puricelli in 1923. Of course, the most famous global highway system is probably the Autobahn, right? Autobahn, you can drive, there's no speed limits. For most of it, there are speed limits when you go through cities. I found this out the hard way. I got a speeding ticket. They said, how can you get a speeding ticket on the Autobahn? Well, there are actually speed limits in places. The Autobahn is first built by the Nazis, actually. It becomes, as we'll talk about later, a focus of Nazi propaganda. But the concept was actually launched in 1925 during the Weimar Republic. So again, 1920s, we have the infrastructure that supports travel coming into development. Whether you're talking about gas stations, whether you're talking about roads and highways that are paved and that are cars only, whether you're talking about travel guides that are going to stimulate and encourage people to move around, all of that structure comes in the 1920s so that in the 1930s, car travel becomes democratized. Okay, finally, we are going to go back to the beginning with the last of our three inventions, which is, of course, the radio. Now, the radio is all about sound, and we saw how the 1920s were, in terms of sound, an era already of revolution. This is a couple decades after the invention of the telephone. This is the era that we see the triumph of jazz and the spreading of jazz. We talked about revolutions in our last podcast episode in terms of dance, and the idea of the dance club and people doing different things with their bodies. So, of course, the radio then fits into, again, a part of this story. If we're thinking about sound, think about also the production of sound. How do we produce sound? Where do we get sound from? Before 1877, most of that sound has to be organically produced. If I want to hear Abraham Lincoln's voice and hear him giving his inaugural address, the only way I can do that is to literally be in the crowd. And if you can imagine being in a crowd in the mall and here comes Lincoln and he's going to give his speech without an electric amplification, how far is that going to go? How many people are actually going to hear his voice? So one of the first major inventions that begins to change the nature of sound was the development of the phonograph, or sometimes it's called the gramophone, by Thomas Edison in 1877. In the 1880s, Alexander Graham Bell and Company began engraving sound on wax discs, giving birth to what becomes the modern record. Now, over the course of the first 3 decades of the 20th century, the popularity of the gramophone grew tremendously, so that by the time you get to 1928, over 2.5 million gramophones exist in the United Kingdom. Another big kind of invention along this way is the creation of the electric amplifier in 1915, which basically will launch the field of electronics. Now, with sound amplification comes not only the development of long-distance telephone lines, but also things like public address systems, sound and motion picture, and of course the big one that we're building towards, which is radio. Imagine again the effect that these devices have on daily life, on ordinary experiences. Think about what life would be like if you had no telephone. Think about your experiences in terms of consuming information. Do you go to church on Sunday? How big can your church be if there is no electric amplification in order to hear the priest's homily? What happens if you go to a sporting event? What size crowd can I have if I don't have a PA announcer? Would you sit there in the nosebleeds and watch a football game if you had no one telling you, how far the runner had run, what down it is, who had the ball? Would it be as exciting? So, of course, the most important revolution in terms of sound during this period is the development of the radio, which one German contemporary described as, quote, the miracle of daily life. Now, the story of radio begins in the 1880s, when a German inventor named Heinrich Rudolf Hertz began to produce and transmit what later became known as radio waves. Radio waves are basically a form of electromagnetic wave. I'm not going to go into much deeper about the scientific part of that. If you want to know about that, you can listen to a science podcast. But basically, he begins inventing all these different types of waves. And for the next decade or two, a variety of physicists experiment with these various types of waves, trying to see what happens if I generate a particular type of wave, how far can it go, how much in terms of quality, in terms of sound can it transmit. Big name here is the Italian inventor Giuliano Marconi. He is generally credited with building the first modern radio in 1896. But again, the technology is very weak. It only sends a signal about 2 miles. But Marconi, like many of these people, is an inventor. He's a tinkerer. So once you get the basics of a technology right, you just keep playing around with it until you make it more and more powerful. One of the things Marconi realizes is if I extend the antenna, I can increase the range of my devices. So it's actually not very long before Marconi's radio signals are being sent across the Atlantic. However, before you have the amplification of sound, we're not talking about transmitting voices yet. This comes in about 1907 when a variety of American inventors start perfecting the technology. There's some limited use of radio, but not much during World War I. But in the aftermath of the war, we start to see the spreading popularity of this medium. November 6, 1919 witnesses the founding of the first radio station. This happens in The Hague in the Netherlands. It goes by the call letters PCGG. And over the course of the 1920s and 30s, radio becomes increasingly popular. The BBC, for example, is founded in 1922. In Berlin, the first official radio station is founded in 1923. Now, the experience of listening radio is very different than what you or I experience. We're talking about not even the size of modern televisions, but bigger than that. These huge, large, expensive, clunky machines. The signal that they produce has plenty of static in it. It is not the nice, clear, Sirius XM satellite radio signal that I can get right now on my phone. In fact, the first radios don't even use speakers. They use headphones. So can you imagine going to listen to the radio and you've got this table-sized device and you have to plug a headphone into it, and then I guess you just sit there and you listen to some jazz music, you listen to some classical music. But again, from these initial small origins, big things, big consequences flow. By 1931, radios are becoming increasingly popular. There are over 3.7 million radios registered in Germany. And by the end of World War II, you're talking about something that probably about 75% of the population has. Now, obviously, many of us love the radio today because of the entertainment value. We love to listen to music. We love to listen to songs. We like to listen to entertainment or information as well. But again, think about the importance of radio in terms of how it affects our culture. Think about something like sporting experiences. If I want to follow a league before the amplification of sound in 1915, most of the way I'm going to do that is either through direct consumption. I'm going to go to the baseball game itself, in which case, participating in it, seeing it, spectating it is limited. Or I'm going to read about it in the newspaper, in which case, okay, here's the box score, here's some information, but it's not the most exciting thing in the world. Right? What makes sports so incredible, what makes us love it, what gives us an addiction to it, in many ways is the drama. What happens when this person is about to take the PK and it's either going to win or lose the game? What happens when that little David goes up against the behemoth, the Goliath? What happens when this particular person does something that no one else has seen before in the past? We don't get that same sense of excitement when we're just consuming that by reading about it in a box score. What we get, what helps us, is the anticipation, the buildup, the consumption of it live. We just lived through the World Cup about 6 months ago. What a dramatic World Cup to see. Here's a shot on goal. Is it going to determine the course of everything? Is it going to miss? Oh my God, he hit the crossbar. That's the drama of sports. That's the addiction. And radio is the first thing that really makes that possible, because radio broadcasts that signal at first to thousands and then eventually hundreds of thousands and eventually millions of people around the globe. Now, kind of a funny anecdote here or asterisk to this story. If I asked you what are the sports that you think would be most powerful to listen to by radio, soccer actually isn't one of them, because a lot of passing going on in the game. It's harder to follow. Football, baseball, much, much more exciting when you're listening on the radio. But the first sporting event that was broadcast live over radio was actually a sailing race. And if you think about, what is exciting, horse racing, very exciting, do that over the radio. I don't know that sailing is the race that is going to capture the drama and the attention over the radio most immediately. I love sailing. It's amazing to go to. It's amazing to be there. I went to the America's Cup in 2007, I believe it was, 2008, somewhere around there, in Valencia in Spain. It was amazing, loved it. But listening to it on the radio, I'm not sure how captivating that would be. But nevertheless, it grows, it becomes more popular. Again, as we talked about, there is also a kind of long-term effect here in terms of politics. In the beginning, it doesn't really matter how effective a politician is at speaking. Yes, there are moments, the French Revolution, talking about someone like Robespierre and the Jacobin Club. Yes, his oratory skills matter tremendously. But there are a lot of really crappy orators before this. We don't have auto recordings of Abraham Lincoln. We do know that the big speech that he gave, the most famous speech, the Gettysburg Address, a whole bunch of people went, wow, this is terrible. This is short. It's not really that moving. It takes time for the words to matter, right? The people that sat there and listened to it, oh, this doesn't matter. But it wasn't over the radio, so nobody cared about it. Radio begins to change this. We already mentioned at the beginning of the podcast Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his so-called fireside chats. Think about leaders like Adolf Hitler. Think about Paul von Hindenburg. Think about how the first time ordinary people in the 1930s get to hear the voice of their leader, and they get to hear the voice not just of some speech, but that the leader cares about me. This is incredibly powerful. This is something that for the first generations to experience, it's not expected. And so it becomes powerful. It feels like a connection, and it supports, one could argue, structures of power in the 1930s especially. Of course, it also undermines it, right? World War II comes along. What's a big no-no in Germany? Listening to the BBC. Because you can get the other side of the story that you're not necessarily getting from Joseph Goebbels. Okay. As we've talked about today, the Europe of 1919 is starting to become a fundamentally different place than it had been before the war. Not only in terms of politics, not only in terms of art, not only psychologically due to all the death and destruction. Okay, by this point, you're like, okay, I get it. World War I changed a lot of things. But the physical landscapes of Europe began to change as modern technologies conquer time and space. Airplanes carry individuals rapidly over great distances, granting Europeans a new sense of mobility that was borderline unimaginable just a generation before. The automobile emancipates them from their local geographies, opening up all aspects of their national and international landscapes for exploration. For the first time, so many people could truly go anywhere they wanted to, whenever they wanted to. In another sense, whole new industries and institutions are either born or enabled or enhanced by the mechanization of travel. Again, think about the modern world. Think about modern institutions. What do the police look like if they have no cars? What about firefighting? What about armies? What about doctors, EMTs, construction, food services? So much of our modern world is built on the notion of automobile travel. Finally, the sounds of European society were themselves changing, saturated by an ever-increasing amount of electrified sound. Again, just try to imagine, what does your world look like from an audio perspective without electrified sound? It would sound so different from the world that we inhabit. The end results of all these changes can be a little difficult to quantify, since they led in so many different directions. But what we can say is that a great gap opened between what had been and what was now. As historians, we like to think about this rupture of modernity, this gap of modernity. We talk about it especially with the French Revolution. But we should be conscious that an equal gap, if not a greater gap, is opened in the period immediately after World War I. For some, this technological change proved the need for further acceleration, for breaking down new barriers and new technologies. It was the achievement of modernism, the symbol, the affirmation of positivism, of progress, and of faith in the human mind and its ability to conquer all challenges. For others, it brought more anxiety, as the world that many had known melted away increasingly in more and more fundamental ways. Again, such is the contradiction of the modern world. Again, this is the contradiction of the modern world. A contradiction that in many ways first began to take shape in the way that we know it in the 1920s. Okay, that's our show for today. I'd like to thank you for listening. If you'd like to find out more about our podcast or about the sources we use, or look for additional reading or film recommendations, have a look at our website, www.historyoffthepage.com. You can also follow us on social media as well. We will be upping our level of social media activism coming in fall 2023. Right now, I know it's a little bit neglected, but It's hard to do these podcasts and produce all the social media at the same time. So again, I'd just like to thank you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed today's episode, and hopefully we'll see you next time as we take history off the page.